Good morning, Brigands. Tom Morton here with Brigand Outdoors, and today I'm in the Grand Canyon, and I thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to talk about the essential gear that you guys will need for any multi-day backpacking trip. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So as I mentioned, today will be part one in a multi-part series, and in this series you guys are going to learn everything you need to know to be successful on any multi-day backpacking trip. So I'm going to talk about my selection criteria for each piece of gear and briefly discuss each piece of gear that I take on any hike. So let's get started. So the very first thing I do when I'm planning any multi-day backpacking trip is I divide my gear into 6 different categories. And those categories are fire, food, water, shelter, safety and security, and last, accessories. And the accessories category is going to be the one that changes from trip to trip, and it's going to change based on the conditions you're going to be while on the hike, such as weather and what you're doing specifically. So if you're mountain climbing, then obviously you're going to need ropes and harnesses and things of that nature. But before we dive into any of the specific gear, we'll have to talk about the backpack, because the backpack and the size of your backpack will determine what all you can carry. The backpack that I've chosen is a 75-liter backpack made by Gregory. It's called the Baltoro. So the Gregory Baltoro 75. There's a few key features that I look for in a bag. One is obviously the size. The size of your backpack determines how much gear you can bring. How much gear you have generally determines how long you're going to be in the field. 2 is how heavy it is. The Gregory Baltoro comes in at just under 5 pounds. And then, does it have outside access? There's a couple different varieties of backpacks. Some are top loaders, some are side loaders. I like having both. With the top loader backpacks, in order to get into it, oftentimes you're gonna have to, especially if something's on the bottom, you have to pull everything out to get to the item. So when you have a side loader or a front loader, that enables you to open up and access the whole volume of the bag all at once. So now that we're done talking about the backpack, the next thing we'll talk about is the fire source. So having a fire source is important for a couple different reasons. One, in an emergency situation, it can be life-saving. It can provide warmth. It can also signal others. But more practically, fire sources are used for food preparation and even building campfires for you and your friends to hang out on a camp. Fire sources range from primitive bow drills, flint and steel, waterproof matches, and even the Bic lighter. The Bic lighter is one that I use most often, and I've used it in the cold, I've used it in the wind, I've used it in the rain, I've used it in the hot, I've used it in temperate. I've used it everywhere, and it's really never failed me. Even still, because they're so small, you can bring multiple. I always bring at least 2, and then kind of my third backup is the piezoelectric lighter on my Jetboil. But what about tinder? So if you're on a hike, it's really likely that you're going to have a lot of wood around you to choose from to build a fire, but sometimes it can rain or it can snow and that wood is damp and it's not a great fire starter. So what I do is I bring a tampon, believe it or not. And tampons are good because the packaging makes them waterproof, and they're basically filled with compact cotton, and cotton happens to burn really well. So I'll demonstrate real quickly how well this burns, and you can see how it would be a great way to start a fire. And so kind of the bottom line here is that although being familiar with primitive fire sources are good, especially in a survival situation, the most practical, cheapest, smallest, and lightest fire source that I bring is the Bic lighter, and I always bring more than a few. So that's what I recommend, and that's what I think you guys should bring with you. Okay, let's talk food. I would guess one of your first concerns when planning any multi-day hike is what you're gonna eat. So just a caveat up front, I'm not going to talk about any specific food item to bring with you. I'm going to cover that in depth in part 2 of this series, which is planning. The things I'll talk about in that are which foods to bring with the highest calories per ounce, which foods are the most packable, which foods will vary how to vary tastes on a hike, which on longer hikes that becomes an issue, trust me. So all that stuff I'll talk about. With all that being said, in today's video, all we're going to talk about is just gear. So when considering gear for food, really you only need to consider two things, which is how you're going to prepare your food and also what you're going to eat your food with. So one of my favorite hiking items in general is the jet boil stove. And in this case, the MSR reactor, which is a newer version that I've just started to use. It's an awesome little lightweight, very packable and easy to clean stove that's powered by fuel canisters. The only issue with these stoves is that at altitude, the butane or isopropane fuel canisters tend not to work quite as well. And one thing that I've done in order to deal with this is just keep the canister close to my body, basically to keep it warm. And while doing that, I've been able to use the stove above 12,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. So basically what I'm saying is it is an issue, but if you deal with it, you'll still be able to use the stove. Okay, so as far as dishes go, there's only three things you need to worry about. So how you're gonna drink, how you're gonna eat, and what you're gonna eat with. For liquids, I just use the cup that comes with the stove, so that's convenient. For eating, I use either a camp spoon or a camp spork. Metal is best because it's easier to clean, but plastic is cheaper. As far as what to eat out of, some people bring tin cups or plastic bowls or whatever. I simply just use the packaging from Mountain House Meals. And these things are neat because they have a Teflon coating because they're meant to accept hot water. So they're really easy to clean. And then when you're done, they pack up really small. So that's really convenient. So the other thing you may have noticed and probably wondering why I included was the bear canister. So the bear canister used to give me a lot of heartache. Just because I didn't really think it was that essential, and also it weighs another 2 pounds, so I didn't really like carrying it. But the reason why I did is because I did a lot of hiking in California, and it's required. And it's required in order to decondition bears from interacting with humans. So over the years I have warmed up to it, and so now I carry it regardless of where I'm going. And the reason why I do carry it now is because it works really well, and it also has other purposes. So the first purpose is just to mask the scent of your food. This obviously helps with bears, but it also keeps smaller stuff away like birds and chipmunks. The second thing is the canister is waterproof. It's basically a giant Nalgene bottle, and so it's a great place to store electronics or other valuables in a storm. And then third is it works as a really nice camp stool in a pinch. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, one of the reasons why I chose the 75-liter bag is so that I could carry the bear canister regardless of where I was going, and then also that gave me the ability to carry everything else I wanted to as well. But if you're hiking in a state that doesn't require the canister, or you just don't think you'll need it, you could easily get away with a 55 or 65-liter bag, which would drop the weight of your total pack altogether. Okay, so water. Other than exposure, having a lack of water will be one of the first things to take you out on a hike. Luckily, there's really only two things you need to consider on a hike in regards to water, and that is water storage, and then also how you're going to filter or purify your water. When it comes to water storage, you have several options. Nalgene bottles these days are really popular. They're relatively cheap and they're really hardy. It's really tough to break a Nalgene bottle. So you may be wondering why not a water bladder. I actually really dislike the water bladder. I used it a lot when I was in the military, and the issue with water bladders is that they have a tendency to pop at the wrong times. And also during storage, if you leave any amount of water in there, they just have a tendency to build up mold. And if that's a surprise you've ever encountered, well, I'll put it to you this way, it's a surprise you never want to encounter. So that brings us to, one last note on that. So your water storage can vary, and that's based on how often you're going to see water on your hikes, and we'll cover that in planning. But basically, if you're going to encounter water all the time on the trail, then you only need to bring a small amount of water storage. But there's many hikes that I've done where you only see water once a day, or even less than that. And so you're going to have to have the ability to bring a lot of water. As a general rule of thumb, I generally go through about a gallon of water a day, and that includes drinking on the trail and also food preparation at night. So the next thing we need to talk about is your water filter or purifier. Most modern filters do exactly what water purifiers do, so I'll spare you the details on the difference. But the bottom line is you want a filter that's going to filter out common bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, and any other particulates in the water. And most modern ones do that really well. Also, most modern filters have a service life of somewhere around 300 gallons, which is actually a lot more than you think, and it'll last you for a while. And then finally, most modern water filters give you the ability to clean the filter, which extends the service life even further. One thing to note, which I found out the hard way, unfortunately, is that, and it's kind of one issue with a water filter in general, is that if you're in freezing temperatures and you leave water residue inside the filter, that water will freeze and it'll expand and destroy the internal filter. So basically what you need to do is just spend a couple extra minutes to get as much water out of there as you can, and then at nighttime keep the filter next to your body or inside your sleeping bag in order to keep it from freezing. So in my mind, the shelter is made up of a couple components. So you have your tent, you have your sleeping bag, and then you have your foam or air sleeping pad. I would say that the foam pad or the air pad, I would call that optional, but to me, I always bring it for a couple different reasons. When you're hiking all day long, you really need to maximize sleep so you can recover and go again the next day. I find that I sleep much better on a pad, and I've done both foam and air. Air, I think, gives you a better, more comfortable sleep, and also insulates you from the ground better than the foam pad does. And that's another important reason why you would want to bring a sleeping pad, is that it insulates your body from the ground, and so you're going to stay way warmer in cold environments. The tents come in a wide variety of sizes and categories. So you have your super ultra lightweight, basically tarps that are lean-tos, which weigh ounces, all the way up to what I call glamping, so your car camping tents that are 10 pounds with foam mattresses and all that stuff. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. So just remember, we're focused on multi-day hikes, and so I choose sort of the lighter weight option, but it's still fully enclosed. My favorite tent by far is the Copper Spur by Big Agnes. So here's a couple stats with the Copper Spur. So the one that I'm going to show you is the three-person tent. The one that I take with me if I'm going by myself is the two-person tent. And you might be asking yourself, why bring a two-person tent? The good thing about the two-person tent is it's only a few ounces more than the one-person tent, and it gives me a lot more space to store my gear indoors rather than outdoors. And as far as weights go, that was kind of one of the biggest reasons why I chose that tent. So the two-person tent, the one I take when I'm going by myself, comes in at about 2.5 pounds, which is super light. It also packs down to about 15 inches by 6 inches in a cylinder, so it's easily packable. That's another thing. It's fully enclosed, meaning it's got mesh on all of the walls. So if there's no weather, you're fully enclosed from bugs, and then if there is weather, there's also a rain fly that attaches to give you to make you resistant to the elements. It's fully waterproof. It's just such a great option. There's so many options out there, so I definitely encourage you to do your research. But as a starting point, I would definitely start with the Big Agnes Copper Spur. And so the last and final thing on the shelter category is your sleeping bag. Again, sleeping bags come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. I think the best all around is your mummy style sleeping bag. And as for a 3-season option or even a 4-season option, basically you want to choose something that's going to give you warmth up to about 30 degrees. All sleeping bags these days are rated to their comfortable sleeping temperature. The one I'll show you is, I believe it's a 25-degree bag made by REI. Comes in at under 2 pounds. So again, super light, and it packs down really small. The other consideration for sleeping bags in particular is you have kind of two options for packing material. So you have synthetic fill and you have down fill, so natural fill. Here's basically the real quick rundown. Synthetic packing materials offer greater warmth if they become wet, and but are generally heavier and don't pack down as nice as down does. Down gives you a little bit better warmth for less weight, meaning the fill, you get more warmth for less fill with the down option. But if the down becomes wet, then it doesn't work nearly as well. The other issue, or not an issue, a benefit to using natural or down filled sleeping bags is that they pack down super small in comparison to their synthetic counterparts. Safety and security, it's another category we got to talk about. So I know the word security may raise some alarms, but I'll walk you through sort of my thought process and some of the items that I generally don't leave home without. So, safety from or security from humans really isn't that big of a deal. It's not something you're likely to have to worry about, especially in the United States or in most national parks. But more likely, you're going to run into an issue with predatory animals such as bears or cats. And in those events, you want to be able to defend yourself. I personally feel a lot more safe defending myself with a firearm, but the truth is they're not really practical because they're heavy, and also they're just not allowed in most parks. So a much more practical option is bear mace, and bear mace has been shown to slow and repel predatory animals, from bears to mountain lions. And so that's really one item you should consider bringing with you as far as security goes on any hike. So the other thing we got to talk about is safety. So safety is obviously a concern while hiking because being in the wilderness is inherently less safe than being at home. So most people deal with the safety aspect with a civilian bought med kit, and these med kits are fine and they're generally loaded with things that you could use. However, sometimes they're expensive and they're generally loaded with more things that either have very specific use or limited use, and so I think there's better options. So basically what I do is I build my own med kit, and I just build it in a Ziploc bag. So one thing I definitely will never leave home without is a tourniquet. And the tourniquet, if I had to choose the most important item for safety, I choose that because I think the most life-threatening thing that you can encounter on the trail is a deep laceration. And so a deep laceration can happen a variety of different ways, a fall, a scrape, or whatever. But that's something that could potentially kill you, especially when you're far away from home. So a tourniquet has been shown on the battlefield for years to stop bleeds, and it's really effective. As far as bandages go, I don't really think band-aids are really necessary, and that's generally the majority of what's in a civilian bought med kit. I think you can do the same thing that you can do with a band-aid with duct tape, a piece of shirt, or a better option would be a sterile piece of gauze. And the gauze has more functionality, so I would prefer to bring gauze and then use duct tape to adhere it to you. Some other useful things as far as safety goes, and I usually bring, is some pain medication for swollen ankles or hurt knees. If I'm hiking in the mountains, I'll bring anti-altitude sickness pills. I believe they're called Diamox. And I'll also bring some Imodium because being on the trail, it's just generally less, you're just a little bit more dirty than you would normally be. And so, sometimes you can encounter stomach problems as a result. And so Imodium will help you with that. And last and finally, as I kind of already mentioned, duct tape. Duct tape can be used in a pinch for a variety of different things. You can use duct tape to build a splint for a broken leg or a sprained ankle. Duct tape can be used to, patch stuff on your kit, and it can also be used as a makeshift band-aid. So duct tape is the one I would bring. And I would say that if you build your own med kit based on your own specifications, it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be lighter, and it's going to be more packable than the civilian bought version. Okay, the last and final category that we'll talk about is accessories. As I mentioned before, accessories vary with every single trip that you go on, so this list will not be comprehensive or exhaustive, but I have narrowed down the accessories for you guys that I bring on every single trip. And the first accessory that we'll talk about is sun protection. So it is likely that when you're on a hike, you're going to be exposed to the sun basically all day long. So you need to consider how to protect yourself from the sun. This can be done in basically two main ways, either with clothing or with sunscreen. So here's the issue with clothing. If it's hot outside, you definitely don't want to be wearing long sleeves. So then you're going to need sunscreen. So generally, you're going to use a combination of both. So even in the hot temperatures, you're going to use sunscreen, which I always carry a small vial with me, and then combine that with sunglasses and a hat. And then in the cold, you're obviously going to be having longer layers on, and so you may not need sunscreen as much. The second accessory that we'll talk about is clothing. We kind of talked about a little bit in the last one. And clothing is going to be super varied, but basically what clothing you bring is going to depend on what the temperature is. For hotter temperatures, I like nylon pants, very breathable pants, and also nylon or synthetic shirts. Cotton is fine, but cotton does not perform well in the cold, and so I kind of always lean towards synthetic materials. For colder temperatures, I've kind of found sort of a secret little mix that has been really successful for me, and that mix is a Gore-Tex top and bottom, which is rainproof and also windproof. And then my base layer is Polypro, and it's sort of like, it's similar to what I'm wearing now, a little bit tighter. It's meant as an undergarment, and those two together, which I'll show you here, has kept me warm in the snow and blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, and it's really useful, especially when moving, because it's not so hot that you feel like you need to take layers off. The third thing I always bring is a watch. A watch is one of those things that help me execute my plan throughout the day. So oftentimes I'm trying to hit a certain amount of miles in a day to keep on track for the total route, and I kind of do that via a watch, so I know I need to be at certain places at certain times, and it helps me stay on track. The other benefit to having a watch is that most modern watches now are built in with a compass, an altimeter, and a barometer. All three of those things are really useful tools in navigation, and if you find yourself lost, they definitely will give you the ability to find your way home. Speaking of navigation, we're going to cover that in depth in part 3 of this series. So I'll give you all the knowledge you guys need to navigate your way out of basically any situation. So speaking of navigation, that's another category that's got a variety of different tools you can use. But here's the deal. Everybody has a phone. Almost everybody has a smartphone. And there are several very powerful apps that you can use in order to navigate. The one I use with my iPhone is called Topo Maps. It's been out for a few years now. And it's really powerful because even when you don't have service, as long as you pre-download the maps of the area you're going to be in, the GPS dot still works, and so you can navigate even without service. Even with a very short lesson on how to use Topo Maps, it is basically impossible to get lost, which again we will cover in part 3. Okay, another category of accessories I always bring is some way to waterproof. So having the ability to waterproof is beneficial for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, if you get rained on, you don't have waterproofing, your sleeping bag's going to get wet and all your base layers are going to get wet, and then if you combine that with a cold, you could be in trouble. So how do you waterproof? So for smaller items, I generally use Ziploc bags. Again, they're cheap and they're very packable. For larger items, I use dry bags. And the dry bag that I use, I believe it's called Sea to Summit, and you can get those at REI for not real expensive. The other cool thing about a dry bag is while sleeping, you can stuff it with your spare clothes and it turns into a pillow. Okay, so one of my absolute favorite accessories that I will never leave home without is duct tape and 550 cord. There's a saying in the military that if you can't solve a problem with duct tape and 550 cords, you can't solve it, and I definitely believe that to be true. Duct tape has so many uses. We mentioned some of them in the safety part, but patching holes in clothing. I've used them to keep the sole of my boot onto my shoe. You can use them as bandages. You can repair a hole in your water bottle or water bladder. There's just so many uses of duct tape. You just have to bring it with you. Now, don't bring a whole roll of duct tape. What I usually do is I'll rip off a 10 or 12 foot section of it and I'll roll it on itself as shown here, and it's really packable and very convenient. Then the 550 cord. So what is 550 cord? 550 cord is paracord. It's rated to 550 pounds. It's just basically really strong line that is really light and really packable. So Some uses for paracord are they're really good replacement shoelaces. You can use them to construct, or you can tether branches together to create a lean-to for a primitive shelter. Tying, I mean, basically any reason why you need to tie something together. I've used it to make a sling for my rifle. I've used it to make a makeshift belt. I've used it to make a makeshift sling. As we mentioned before, with making a splint, you could use 550 cord to make a splint in a pinch. So if there's one thing you're going to bring as far as accessories go, it 100% should be duct tape and 550 cord. Okay, and finally, the knife. So you guys know how important knives are. I know how important knives are. I'll spare you all the details, but you should always have some sort of knife with you. It can be used to make tools. It can be used to defend yourself. It can be used in food preparation. And so you should always have some sort of knife. What knife you bring and what size is really up to you. One thing I'll mention though is that most multi-tools these days come with a blade inside. So I've kind of shifted from bringing a knife specifically to a multi-tool because a multi-tool is filled with a billion other tools, and it's also a good item to consider for the accessories. All right, guys, that pretty much covers it. I know there was a lot in this video, but if you guys bring these things on a hike, you will be able to deal with 95% of any situation you'll deal with in the woods. And as I mentioned, all of this stuff all together, everything I mentioned today in a pack, even with food and water, will not weigh more than 35 pounds. So the 35 pounds is still really light, and it'll enable you to travel basically whatever distance you want, and it'll only get lighter as you consume your food. All right, guys, I hope this was informative. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series, where we will go over planning in depth, we'll go over navigation in depth, and we'll also go over how medical applications in the field. All right, guys, talk to you later.